cabe-me a mim a inauguração da moderação dos painéis, e dado que isto é um painel internacional, eu vou mudar o chip para o inglês. So, good morning and welcome everybody. So this is the first panel, so it is entitled Prison Education, the Situation in Portugal and the International Context. So we're going right away to the speakers. We start with Thomas, right? So the first speaker will be Thomas Wüthrich. So he's from Switzerland and he's the chair of the European Prison Education Association since 2023. He holds a Master of Arts and an Executive Master in Non-Profit Management. He is an experienced manager in the NGO sector. He's got a wide network in prison education and the prison system, and he's got international expertise and project experience. From 2020 to 2023, he was the regional head of education in prison in Eastern Switzerland at the Swiss Center of Competence in Prison and Probation. Since 2018, he has been president of the Association for the Development of Probation Services in Eastern Europe. So, Thomas?
Yes. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Do you hear me? Okay. So, hello everybody. Good afternoon or good noon. First, I would like to thank you very much for inviting the EPA to the APENP conference. I would have loved to attend personally. Unfortunately, commitments made abroad some time ago made this impossible. However, I hope to be able to share a few thoughts and information with you in this way. I will share my screen now. So, I will divide my presentation in 4 parts. Firstly, a brief history of the EPA, then on the Council of Europe's recommendations on education in prison and on the Nelson Mandela rules. In the third part, I set out our thoughts on the role of the EPA, and finally, I will take a look into the near future. In the 1980s, representatives of prison education, particularly from the English-speaking world and Scandinavia, met from time to time to exchange ideas. It soon became clear that this exchange had needed to be institutionalized. The first EPA conference was held in England in 1984. This was followed by others in 89, 91 and 93, where the experts were particularly keen to contribute their expertise to the drafting of the prison rules of 1987 and the recommendation on education in prison of 1989 of the Council of Europe. It also quickly became clear that an information medium was needed for exchange. The first newsletter was published in March 91. This was still done by post at the time, and the newsletter was sent to liaison persons in several countries for further distribution. Finally, in 93, at the conference in Sweden, the EPA was officially founded as a legal entity with the adoption of the first constitution, which is to a large extent still in force today. At the same time as the Council of Europe, was working on recommendations in the prison system, research was also focusing intensively on the question of which factors should be taken into account to reduce reoffending. Among other things, the model you see on the slide was developed that gave education at least one of 8 positions. Personally, I believe that education has much more to offer than is reflected in this model. Too often I have the impression that security aspect is still far too strongly emphasized in prisons. The educational program seems to stand in direct contrast to it. I have the impression that we educators see the glass half full with our clients, while the prison system primarily sees the risk. In other words, the glass half empty. Resource orientation versus deficit orientation. The recommendations of the Council of Europe in 1989 were certainly a milestone in the establishment of education in prison. All prisoners should have access to education, and education should serve the holistic development of every imprisoned person. The recommendations are also the cornerstone and legitimation for the existence and work of the EPA. But implicitly, the recommendations show that there are different forms of education. Traditional formal education aims to achieve a formal school qualification or a language certificate, for example. Informal education includes general education or personal development content. I have often experienced how any kind of education increases self-confidence and self-esteem of our students. And for this kind of education, you don't need a paper at the end. Finally, there is non-formal education, which I personally consider to be increasingly important. After all, people with little or no education are often easier to reach with programs that are not associated with school. By motivating them to take part in these activities, they are more likely to be attracted to school lessons later on. The Nelson Mandela rules essentially confirm the recommendations of the Council of Europe. What is noteworthy, however, is the focus on vulnerable groups. Illiterate people and young prisoners in particular should be given special attention. Everywhere I have been on prison visits, I've heard that the level of education of prisoners is declining. This means that more efforts are needed to give these people a better start after release. This rule addresses a very central point. People in prison are part of society and should be respected and treated as such. Exclusion from social structures only increase recidivism. Inclusion rather than exclusion is therefore the motto. The role of the EPA. Teachers and inmates have no lobby. The EPA is there to give them all a voice. Teachers should learn from each other through dialogue. Even if the framework conditions within Europe are very different, the pedagogical mission and the pedagogical work remain essentially the same everywhere. The principles of adult education are universal, but teachers in prison work under very special conditions. However, they often receive too little support from their employer, be it the Ministry of Education or the Ministry of Justice. And the EPA also must ensure that education in prison is increasingly improved and is in no way inferior to what is on offer outside the walls. And that there are always opportunities to connect with the educational programs outside the walls so that the participants can continue their chosen path. I would like to show you a 7-minute film that addresses various issues that are specific to education in prison and that need to be taken up, discussed and raised with the responsible authorities by the EPA. It's in German and French with English subtitles.
Der Morgen. Mein Arbeitstag beginnt früh. Was erwartet mich heute? Werden alle am Unterricht teilnehmen? Herr Paal hat mir letzte Woche von seinem Gerichtstermin erzählt. Wie ist es wohl gelaufen? Wie geht es ihm heute? Am Morgenrapport um 7:00 behandle ich alle wichtigen Informationen. Herr A. wurde gestern zu einem mehrjährigen Haftstrafe verurteilt. Er kommt heute nicht in den Unterricht. Der Unterricht beginnt pünktlich um 7:45. Auch hier, im ersten Untersuchungsgefängnis der Schweiz, das BIST-Unterricht anbietet. Ich sehe es als Privileg, den Teilnehmenden individuelle Lernprogramme anbieten zu können. Hier zum Beispiel lernt seit einigen Monaten Spanisch. Er macht ordentlich Fortschritte. Herr C. bereitet sich auf seine theoretische Fahrprüfung vor. Er lernt Englisch. Herr B. interessiert sich für Gedichte und schreibt selbst welche. Und Herr E. findet Gefallen an den größten Philosophen. Jeder nach seinen Fähigkeiten und seinen Interessen. Schließlich finden sich hier in der Untersuchungshaft Personen mit den vielfältigsten Lebensgeschichten, von Lehrerbrechern bis zu ausgebildeten Psychologen. Diese Vielfalt gefällt mir. Es gefällt mir, wie hier und passend ihre erlernte Skills zu Zukunftsvisionen werden. Gerne wüsste ich manchmal, was aus diesen und jenen Teilnehmern geworden ist. Doch im Gefängnis ist oft bereits die Dauer des Unterrichts ein Problem. Gerade letzte Woche wurde einer meiner Teilnehmer von einem auf den anderen Tag in ein anderes Gefängnis verlegt. Ich konnte mich nicht einmal verabschieden.
Heute kommen alle 6 Teilnehmer in den Unterricht. Eine angenehme Gruppengröße. So kann man sich in der Gruppe austauschen und ich kann trotzdem auf die individuellen Bedürfnisse eingehen. Das autonome Handeln der Insassen steht bei mir an oberster Stelle. So steht auch in unserem Lehrplan, dass die Bildungsteilnehmenden befähigt werden sollen, den Alltag in der Anstalt selbstständig zu bewältigen. Heute steht Ernährung auf dem Stundenplan. Das Lernziel ist, neben den Fachkompetenzen gleichzeitig auch immer Sozialkompetenzen zu vermitteln. Und ich bin immer wieder erstaunt, ob der positiven Dynamik, die sich hier im Ist-Unterricht ergibt. Der Unterricht ist für die Inhaftierten eine höchst willkommene Abwechslung. Wohl auch deshalb sind Reibereien äußerst selten. Wenn ich manchmal so in die Runde blicke, wird mir bewusst, aus welchen unterschiedlichen Kontexten und Ländern die Bildungsteilnehmenden stammen. Wir unterrichten Inhaftierte aus über 100 verschiedenen Nationen. Nach dem Unterricht räumen wir gemeinsam das Unterrichtszimmer auf. Endlich finde ich etwas Zeit, um mich mit Kolleginnen und Kollegen und mit den Verantwortlichen meiner Anstalt auszutauschen. Dieser Austausch ist für mich essentiell und motivierend. Nicht von ungefähr kommt der Spruch, gemeinsam geht es besser.
Les politiques de sécurité et la salle de place, il ne s'écoule que quelques minutes. Les 3 participants sont déjà là. Parfois, M. F et M. G ont comme si les cours ne les concernaient pas. Pourtant, les deux font beaucoup de progrès en France. Quant à M. H, avant le cours fait, il n'avait presque pas de connaissances en informatique. Maintenant, on voit clairement à quel point il a plaisir à travailler sur le reste. Je perçois souvent la manière dont les progrès accomplis influencent la personnalité du participant. Après sa libération, M. H voudrait entreprendre une formation d'informaticien et M. G espère passer bientôt en régime vert pour pouvoir commencer un apprentissage de la langue de propreté. En tant qu'enseignant, et je trouve très satisfaisant de voir que grâce à la formation, on ne transmet pas seulement du contenu, on améliore aussi la confiance de soi et l'estime personnelle de l'apprenant. La formation ouvre de nouvelles perspectives. Je suis content de pouvoir parler avec mes collègues pour préparer les leçons à venir. Car on sait, revenir sur un cours, c'est préparer le prochain. Après une journée de travail chargée, la prison. Fatigué, c'est vrai, mais je suis satisfait de la manière dont c'est déroulé. Avant de revenir chez moi, je me promène 20 minutes au bord de la rivière pour me ressourcer dans la nature. C'est un moment indispensable.
Okay, so the EPA promotes the dialogue between teachers within Europe. Good examples of this are, of course, the EPA conference, but also the webinars that we organized at the beginning of the pandemic. The newsletter, which is now published 4 times a year, and to which contributions from all sides are welcome, also from you, also serves as a platform for dialogue. But the EPA must and wants to do even more. Various documents are in preparation. For example, the mentoring of teachers in prison, A draft of this document will be discussed with teachers and other interested parties in webinars before it is adopted. Fundamentally, the EPA wants to help optimize and even improve the working conditions for the teachers in prison. This requires a constant dialogue with each other. The film also shows that education must already be offered in remand prisons from the first day as the persons are detained. The recommendations of the Council of Europe must be implemented in all prisons. I know of too many prisons in Switzerland in particular, most of them which are small, where there is no education program at all, or only a sparse one. Prisoners must receive customized education according to their abilities, skills and needs. Tailor-made. One person writes poetry, another prepares for the theory test for their driving license, and yet another wants to study. Everything should be possible, just like outside. The most difficult part is certainly finding the right dialogue with decision makers and policy makers. But ultimately, the EPA must succeed in convincing them that the Council of Europe's recommendations should be implemented consistently, even if this costs money. But in our opinion, however, this is money well spent, as educational work significantly reduces reoffending. The EPA is still in a delicate situation. The steering committee solved or improved many issues in the last 2 years. But one thing is clear. If the EPA wants to have a future, we need to attract more members. We must continue to discuss how we want to achieve this in detail in the steering committee. But we have interesting prospects of gaining new members from Austria, Germany and Luxembourg. However, we are also concerned that we have hardly any presence in Eastern Europe and have no connections to improve the situation. It is also regrettable that we have very few members in Italy and Spain. APEnP in Portugal is a positive exception of the southern region of Europe. A new Council of Europe recommendation on education in prison is due to be adopted at the end of 2025. The EPA will do everything in its power to contribute its expertise here. The steering committee also intends to submit a draft to the members, which will be discussed together. In particular, an attempt will be made to incorporate the concerns of teachers also in the recommendations. And then finally, it's also about money. The more members the EPA has from many European countries as possible, the more likely we are to receive financial support from the EU or the Council of Europe. This is absolutely essential. In the long term, professional work can no longer be carried out by enthusiasts working voluntarily and unpaid. Within the next 3 to 5 years, the EPA must be financially supported to the extent that an office can be staffed with at last 2 full-time positions. The office does not even have to be physically located because practically all work can be done from home, but only by paid staff. Education is is not just about the accumulation of skills or the acquisition of knowledge. More, it includes many competencies that can enable personal fulfillment. Education enhances the lives of us all, opening up a world of reading, culture, history, identity, and understanding. It's about consciousness raising. Adult education, and as part of it, the education in prison, is about enriching people's lives, building communities and sustainable societies. It is the ambitious objective to empower learners to make a positive contribution to the civic life of our communities, thus creating a better society for all. Therefore, education is about empowering, inclusion, and active citizenship of the learners. Thank you very much for your attention. I don't hear nothing.
Thank you so much for your presentation. So Thomas Wüthrich talked about the role of the EPEA in prison education throughout Europe, a journey to the past and its history, but also the challenges for the future. The 4 M's, more money and more members, are essential. So we move on to the next presentation. So the next presentation is about prison education in Portugal, paths and challenges. The speaker is José Alberto Pinto. So José Alberto Pinto has a PhD from the University of Trás-os-Montes and Alto Douro, and in Portugal, of course, and in the field of professional development of prison teachers, and a diploma of advanced studies in didactics and school organization from the University of Santiago de Compostela in Spain. So José has taught in Portuguese prisons since 2007 and has collaborated with several institutions that provide education in prisons. From 2017 to 2020, he held the office of Secretary of the European Prison Education Association, EPEA, which we just talked about. He is currently the regional representative for the southern region of Europe on the steering committee of the EPEA. In 2017, together with other prison educators, he founded the Portuguese Prison Education Association, APEnP, the Portuguese branch of the EPEA, of which he became president a year later in 2018. In December 2022, he was elected for a second term. He is currently on secondment to our association at the University of Trás-os-Montes and Alto Douro. So, José, if you please.
Okay. Thank you, Paula. My presentation will be about the prison education in Portugal, paths and challenges. It will be divided into 3 parts. The first part will deal with the international recommendations that support the provision of education to the prison population. In the second part, I will discuss the impact of the 1979 Prison Act on the implementation of a structured prison education program in Portugal. The third part will be dedicated to the presentation of a proposal that the Portuguese Prison Education Association considers relevant for the development of education in prisons in Portugal. I will follow a chronological order, starting with United Nations Standard Minimum Rules for the Treatment of Prisoners, also known as the Nelson Mandela Rules, which recommend that all prisoners should have the right to education, and in particular that it should be made available to all and compulsory for illiterate and young prisoners. And also, education in prisons should be based on a model of education comparable to that available outside, with a view to the effective recognition of qualification and the continuation of studies after release. The 1989 Council of Europe recommendations outlined the main principles of prison education. They proclaim that the right to education is fundamental, especially for the large number of unqualified and unskilled individuals with a background of school failure, most of them early school leavers who present themselves with different educational needs, and that should be addressed. Education contributes to humanizing prisons and improving prison conditions by promoting the well-being of inmates, developing social relationships, making the environment safer and more conducive to rehabilitation. And finally, that prison education is also an important tool for facilitating the integration of inmates into communities and the labour market, reducing the offending and improving their quality of life. Prison education was first put on the agenda of one of the most important events in the field of adult education at the 5th International Conference on Adult Education held in Hamburg in 1997. The Hamburg Declaration and Agenda for the Future located prison education within the framework of adult education and recognized the right of all prisoners to learn. It emphasized that education should be accessible to all prisoners with different levels of education and training. That education should enable inmates to meet their learning needs. And it also stressed the need to provide inmates with access to educational institutions by encouraging initiatives that link courses inside and outside prison. The European prison rules adopted by the Council of Europe in 2006 and recently revised in 2020 uphold the principle that the prison system should provide inmates with access to the widest possible range of educational programs according to their needs and aspirations, and in particular that educational programs should be targeted at young people, inmates with special needs, and all those who lack basic education. And that these programs should also be tailored to the expected length of stay in prison. And now the second part. The 1979 Prison Act and the beginning of a structured program for prison education in Portugal. I will start in the early 1970s. At the beginning of that decade, around 25% of the prison population could not read or write. That is, 1 in 4 prisoners. Until then, prison education had depended mainly on the goodwill of prison staff or on better educated inmates who taught their colleagues, the church, NGOs, and volunteers, among others. But this was a scenario that was to be changed by the 1979 Prison Act. This act put into practice a reform that gave education an important role, a role it hadn't had before. It emphasized the need to organize educational programs specifically for the prison population, for example, with the same curriculum as in schools outside prison, and with an evaluation system similar to that of schools outside prison, in accordance with the United Nations Standard Minimum Rules for the Treatment of Prisoners and the Council of Europe recommendations on prison education. Since then, effective collaboration between the Ministry of Justice and the Ministry of Education has begun to address the critical skills shortage among the prison population. And I would like to highlight 2 important actions. The Ministry of Education became responsible for the organization of educational programs and the teaching to be carried out by its teachers in prisons. And the Ministry of Justice was responsible for creating the necessary conditions for its implementation, namely, providing classrooms and equipment, arranging compatible timetables between prison and school activities, and facilitating inmates' access to classes. The 80s. On the basis of close collaboration between the Ministries of Justice and Education, the course was set for prison education as we know it today. This process was initiated and developed throughout the 80s. The methodology followed was to introduce educational programs in pilot prisons and, depending on the results, to extend them to other prisons in the country. It started with the first cycles of education, namely basic education, and was gradually extended to secondary education. Teachers from schools geographically closer to prisons, known as prison-associated schools, started teaching in prisons. During the 90s, prison education developed rapidly, and by the end of the decade, basic and secondary education were included in a single piece of legislation which is still in force. There are currently 49 prisons in Portugal, 46 of which offer education and training programs. We're talking about a 94% of coverage. With regard to higher education, protocols have been signed with the Directorate General for Reintegration and Prison Services, which is the body responsible for prison management and social reintegration within the Ministry of Justice. And I would like to highlight one of them. The Educ Online at Pris Digital Campus, an ongoing project signed with the Open University in 2016. This project is based on a virtual campus portal consisting of 2 Moodle platforms for the management of educational content to which inmate students have controlled access. But it also includes a third digital resource platform for university extension courses, namely for vocational training and lifelong learning courses. The data on this slide are taken from the Activity and Self-Assessment reports from 2020, 2021 and 2022 of the Directorate General for Reintegration and Prison Services and refer to the 31st December of each year. Regarding inmates' qualifications, in 2019, more than 75% of the prison population had a basic level of education. In the same year, more than 500 teachers taught in Portuguese prisons. Regarding the total number of inmates and the number of inmates enrolled in education and training programs, I should say that the 2020 and the 2021 Activity and Self-Assessment reports clearly show the impact of the pandemic. As the paper shows, in 2019, a pre-pandemic year, there were 12,793 inmates in Portuguese prisons. The following year, 2020, the outbreak of the COVID-19 virus caused this number to fall by 10.8% to 11,412 inmates. In 2021, a period still affected by the pandemic, there was a slight increase compared with 2020, with the number of prisoners rising by 1.5% to 11,588. As regards the impact of the pandemic on inmates' participation in education and training activities, we can see that in 2019, 40% of inmates were enrolled in education and training programs. The following year, 2020, this figure fell to 35.6%, a decrease of 4.4%. Finally, in 2021, it fell further to 34.6%, a decrease of 1% compared to 2020, despite the increase in the prison population. So, this raises an important question. How do we explain these figures? The data clearly show that the number of inmates participating in education and training was already low before the pandemic, 40%. And that the pandemic only contributed to a decrease, 35.6% in 2020 and 34.6% in 2021. With regard to the later 2020 and 2021, some conclusions can be drawn, and they are. The health security measures taken by the prison administration to prevent the spread of COVID-19 led to the suspension of classes on several occasions, which discouraged inmates from participating in education and training programs. Another conclusion is that the shift from face-to-face learning to asynchronous paper-based distance learning also contributed to a decline in inmate participation. These are some of the findings of a study conducted by APEnP in 2020, which I will refer to later in this presentation, and which specifically analyzed the impact of the pandemic on prison education in Portugal. And now, the third part. As already mentioned, it will be dedicated to the presentation of a proposal that APEnP considers relevant for the development of prison education. In 2021, at the Porto Social Summit, organized by the Portuguese presidency of the European Union, the European Commission adopted the European Pillar of Social Rights Action Plan, which sets 3 objectives at European level to be achieved by 2030. And they are: at least 78% of the population aged 20 to 64 should be in employment. A reduction of at least 15 million in the number of people at risk of poverty or social exclusion. Finally, at least 60% of all adults should participate in training programs every year, and the digital skills gap should be closed for at least 80% of European citizens aged 16 to 74. I will focus on the later. In December 2020, 16 million people in Europe were unemployed. And the truth is that low-skilled, low-paid, and temporary workers were the first to be laid off because of the pandemic. And this document aims to prevent such situations. The key to success, it says, is to ensure that adults can participate in upskilling and reskilling programs, especially the most disadvantaged groups, such as the prison population, in order to achieve higher levels of integration into society and the labor market in a digitally transformed world. But the stakes are high, especially for those behind bars, as we'll see next. For the development of prison education in Portugal, APEnP proposes that ICT should play a more active role with the dual objective of achieving educational goals and contribute to increasing inmates' digital literacy. As we've seen, the pandemic has had a huge impact on prison education. This could have been, and in our opinion still can be, a good opportunity to put into practice a new strategy for education in prisons supported by digital technologies in order to meet the objectives set out in the European Pillar of Social Rights Action Plan. In 2020, APEnP conducted a study on the impact of COVID-19 on prison education entitled Distance Learning in Prisons in Portugal in Times of Pandemic. I should emphasize that About 50% of prisons and prison-associated schools participated in this study. One of the main findings was that the teaching model used in Portuguese prisons was mainly based on asynchronous, paper-based distance learning, which had several limitations. One of these was the lack of interaction between the teacher and the students. And this was one of the main causes of inmates' disengagement from the learning activities. Another limitation found was the process of acquirement, development of knowledge and skills became more difficult for the students, most of whom, as we've seen, have only a basic level of education and require continuous guidance and monitoring by the teacher. Finally, the study also showed that the assessment of inmates' learning became more complex as teachers found it difficult to understand their students' learning process and, as a result, to make a fair and rigorous assessment of their performance. And these findings have led to our proposal. So our proposal for the development of prison education in Portugal is that a new strategy supported by digital technologies in a secure and controlled environment should be considered as an option. I would like to emphasize that this proposal is based on several studies and projects developed in prisons which are benchmarks in this field. To this end, two levels of implementation are proposed. One, in terms of educational content. During education and training activities, students should be able to access learning materials available on a pre-selected digital education platform. Second, when face-to-face teaching is not possible, as in the case of the pandemic, education and training activities should be delivered synchronously online using a pre-selected digital platform. And I should point out that only access to teaching and learning content available on this platform should be allowed. And students should also be able to submit their work to teachers for feedback or assessment using the same tool. I would like to emphasize that education and training activities should be carried out by teachers in close collaboration with prisons and under the supervision of the Central Prison Administration. Therefore, given that prison-associated schools and their teachers have not only the necessary experience but also the know-how gained from more than 4 decades of teaching in prisons, we believe that teachers are more than capable of carrying out this task. As if that weren't enough, as I mentioned before, if digital technologies are already at the service of higher education in prisons, as in the case of open university courses, APENP proposes that their access be extended to basic and secondary education as well. Thank you for your time. Thank
you. And presented us with some facts about teaching in prison during COVID presentation, during COVID virus, which was in fact very difficult times. So the third part was dedicated to a presentation of a proposal supported by digital technologies in a secure and controlled way that the association considers essential for the development of education in Portuguese prisons and overcome some of the constraints we felt during COVID. So now we move on to the third presentation by Paal Breivik. Did I say it correctly? So it's about the prison education system in Norway. So Paal Breivik is a sociologist from the universities of Bergen and Oslo in Norway. He worked for 10 years as an assistant professor at the University of Stavanger, Department of Health and Social Care. Changed career in 2007 and started working in public administration at the National Coordination Office for Education on behalf of the Department of Education for Inmates in Prisons, the county government of Vestland. During this time, he has been a member of the steering committee of the Norwegian branch of the European Prison Education Association, FOCO, and for the last 2 years, he has been the representative of the Northern region on the steering committee of the European Prison Education Association. So, if you please, thank you.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. This is my second time in Portugal. My first time was as a young man over 40 years ago, and it made a little impact on my life, because for my first time I experienced a seafood soup in a little village called Painel, just north of Lisbon, and I had the experience eating fish soup with herbs, even with chili. So it started a little revolution in my Norwegian kitchen. So since then I've always had Portugal with me, making my seafood in Norway and selling it to my friends who slowly enjoyed chilies together with the seafood. You know, originally in Norway in old days, we never put any herbs at all with our seafood. Salt and pepper, maybe. So thank you very much. So this is the second time. It's an honor. Thank you. The story I'm going to tell is a bit older than my 40 years in the Portuguese kitchen. It started, I began in the 18th century. It is, when I heard José talking, the Norwegian story about prison education isn't very different from what José was telling you just now. So I will take you through our Norwegian development until today, and have a few perspectives for the years to come for the Norwegian prison education system. Sorry. There. I found it. Before 1950, let us say 1800, the teaching of inmates in prisons were connected with the very strong thought of rehabilitation and treatment. So, and the church was very strong. So one of the main focuses for education was learning the inmates Norwegian, written Norwegian, so they could read the Bible and be truthfully citizens of the country after release. In one period, they actually also taught English in the 1800s, because they knew that many of the inmates were going abroad, out of Norway, to Australia, to the new North America, where they were going to have their new career. So English would be a very good opportunity for them to take with them. Sorry. After 1944, lots of things started changing. We talk about the new welfare state building up very slowly. So we had the thought of education for inmates, primarily for better treatment of inmates. But in the 1950s, there were no questioning of who is going to give the education for inmates. In the 60s, there was a development that actually the correctional services starting to ask the education responsible bodies, isn't it actually your responsibility to give education for inmates? And in the mid-60s, the education department actually said, no, it's not our responsibility. When they are inmates, it must be the Justice Department who is responsible. The real change started in the end of 60s where of course some very strong personal engagement, especially from one prison director who was responsible for a little prison with youngsters that was 16 to 22 years old. And he pushed the movement, said, these guys, it must be the school outside who must be responsible for giving education to these youngsters. So in 1969, we had the big change in Norway, where the Ministry of Church and Education took over professionally and the economically responsibility for education for convicted criminals in Norwegian prisons. It started off with focusing on the young. It was education for young people. Very slowly it grew into a knowledge of education for everybody who needed education. That is, everybody in prison who has the right to education. I'll come back to that. This way of sort of outsourcing education to a body outside the prison was named by the old Professor Wüthrich, criminologist, as the import model. He believed he had the ideology behind it. He believed that this way of importing the civil servants into the prison opens up an otherwise very closed system. So in 1969, and you had the responsibility of education on the education department. It started a very tight administrative collaboration and cooperation between the correctional services and the education authorities. So, as in Portugal, the correctional services, they are obliged to give rooms, classrooms, equipment, etc. for the schools, and the schools come in and to give their education in the classrooms, and that is the school's responsibilities. Here's the short definition of the import model. It's not very important to learn it on, to learn it, but the main knowledge of this import model is the emphasis that the civil rights you have as a citizen outside the prison walls is the same inside the prison walls. So it started off in 1969. It took some time. I'll come back to that. Actually, the last prison to get prison school department was in 2007. So 16 years ago, it was completed. So in short, how does this import model look like? Because it's not only the schools, it's all the civil bodies. We say that the only role, the most important role for the criminal justice system is to keep the prisoners within the prison walls, and they have the main responsibility of rehabilitation and cooperation with all the external bodies coming inside the prison walls. They have tried to sort of make a simple sketch of how it looks like. The biggest part is the school part. We have approximately 4,000 inmates in Norwegian prisons, and 1,600 to 2,000, nearly 40%, the same as you attend school during a week time. So we have some 100, we have 350, we say, teachers, full-time, part-time, in the school departments in the different responsible schools. The healthcare is the next body, and then the workforce is the third biggest. And we have municipalities who are responsible for the libraries. They are the third biggest imported. And we have some other, we have some churches and things like that also imported into the prison system. So here's what we sort of say is the founding of the import model. It is actually Nelson Mandela rules in practice. Prisoners have the same access to social services as other citizens. All the non-penal functions are placed with bodies outside the prison walls. And, as I'm going to focus later on when I'm talking, it is the imported body who is responsible and accountable for what they serve to the inmates. And that's an important thing. When we have audits, it's the education audit body who looks upon how does the responsible school deliver education to inmates. It is not the correctional services who audit the schools giving education. And the main knowledge, the main focus is, of course, the knowledge that is summed up in the question, who do you want to have as your future neighbor? Is it the man who has been isolated for 10 years, or is it the person who has had the opportunity to make a change during the last 10 years to be prepared for being your neighbor? It took some time. In Portugal, you were a bit earlier than us. Not before in 2014, this import model was regulated in the Education Act. It's strange, but it took so long time. All the prisons got a school department in 2007. But the Education Act was dated so late as 2014. Before we got the Education Act, which is really, it's wide. It has, I'll come back to it, it's a very wide right to education. We argumented and relied on the international laws and conventions according to the right to education for inmates. So this is how the little passage in our Education Act is stated. The right to education, according to the Education Act in Norway, is upper primary and upper secondary school, that is until you are 18, 19 years old. And the Education Act in Norway is also rather wide, as I said just in a second ago. It is also for all grown-ups. From the 1st of August this year, the Education Act is for all grown-ups. Even if you've already finished off one upper secondary, you have a right to take a second upper secondary degree. So it is actually, until, first of all, usually I say that 65%, we know that 65% of the inmates has a right to education, according to the Education Act we have now. But from the 1st of August, we have to say that actually every inmate has a right to education according to this Education Act, because he always has the right to a new upper secondary as a grown-up. So it's rather radicalized. We reach approximately 40% of the inmates with our school activities. That is, 40% of the inmates, they attend school one or several days during the week. 60 to 70% of the pupils attending the schools, they attend the vocational training programs. The money, that is important part, the money for the responsible schools comes from the education department. So it is a line with money coming next besides the criminal justice system. It's every year it's stated in the Norwegian Parliament how much is going to be used every year, and the last 20 years it's gone happily this way. It's a problem because the funding for correctional services has gone this way. So we have some problems. So, as I understand, you have it in Portugal. There is a school authority. The school authorities are responsible for prison education, and it is always a local school nearby prison who delivers the education means and for the prison, in the prison, within the prison walls. We call it a branch of the main school. So the teachers working, they can have part-time at the main school and part-time in the prison branch during the week. I have been talking until now on mandatory and upper secondary levels. We're not very good on higher education. We have an issue there, but the teachers often help or supply the students who want to attend higher education and have own classrooms with digital tools, so it makes them possible to attend higher education. But that's an Achilles in the Norwegian system, higher education. The amount of foundings is approximately, we say that it's enough to have approximately 7 to 8 full-time teachers per 100 inmates. So I guess it's a rather good founding. It's stable, luckily. There are no big political issues connected to the foundings, and it's going the right way, luckily. And for my finishing remarks, I have 2 more pages. So is everything okay? Yeah. No? Since education is given by the ordinary educational systems, the audit, the control of the given education is by the ordinary audit systems in the Norwegian system. They are auditing every year what is given of educational offers to the inmates. If I summarize the last years of notes from the different audits which has been made the last year, there are some main cores. There are some main focuses. The national audit says the schools lack formalities both on the admission procedures and the decisions connected to the intake of students in the school curricula. That is one of the main summarizing from the audits. The second is the questioning if the right to education has been offered to everyone who has the right to education. What is the consequences of these findings? The main consequences, as I read it, is the loss of right to education, in the understanding right to education on the same level as outside prison walls. There's no point in giving or starting an education inside the prison walls which you can't continue when you get out of prison after the release. So the main focus on the audit, as I read it, is that what you started on within the prison walls must be equivalent or the same as what you find outside the walls. So when you get out of prison, get your release, you can continue on the same curricula as you started on within the prison walls. So it's an important issue connected to the seamless way out of prison to ordinary society life. We have also had a big national audit, that is what we call the Riksrevision, that is an audit out of the Parliament, of the Norwegian Parliament, and that is an audit to focus if the decisions made in the Norwegian Parliament is followed up in the civil servants. So they had an audit investigation of health, education and welfare services for inmates in jail. They had 2 focuses. Are the correctional services good enough coordinating the civil servants giving their services to the inmates, and are the different civil servants good enough to give what they are obliged to give? So it was a big audit, lots of discussions, and we're still working on the findings. So here are 3 core issues they focused on. The correctional services are not good enough to facilitate for a good return back to society. So there are 2 focuses there. They don't make it possible for all the civil servants to give what they have to give, and they don't coordinate it well enough for the good release. And there are shortcomings in the services offered to the inmates. I heard José talking about the digital tools or the lack of digital tools. That was the main focus for the national audit. You have to have good digital tools to do your obliged work. And without good enough digital tools, within the prison walls, you don't have you don't do good enough work for the good release. So according to the school bodies, we have the digital tool, but it's not good enough. So we're working on a new one to answer this national audit. And we are not, on the last point, we are not good enough to talk to each other, the different civil bodies and the correctional services, when we work side by side within the prison walls. Without the good cooperation within the prison walls, there will be never a good release for the inmate. No inmate should be left alone on a Friday afternoon with a plastic bag and nobody to take care of him. The ideal world will be that there will be a school, there will be a workplace, there will be somebody waiting for the newly released when he gets out of the prison walls. There should be something, and we should never have the situation where they are put outside the prison walls Friday at 2 o'clock. It does happen still this year, I've heard. It should never happen, and that is also what the national audit says. It's a shame for our society that this happens. So, we have something to work on for the years to come. We have started the work, and the audit says, they always say, when they have a big audit like this, we will come back in 4 to 5 years and see what have you done, what's the difference. So actually, we're working very hard these years to show that we have done some changes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation. So Paal Breivik provided us with an outline of the model of importing civil services into the prisons, the Norwegian import model, for the example of education for inmates in Norwegian prisons. So this was a compressed storytelling about the historic development where the education department first resisted the thought of being responsible for prison education, but now, today's state of the situation, now the school authorities are responsible for prison education and the principle of normalization, and is underlined in the Norwegian Education Act. And in your presentation, I realized there are many similarities with the Portuguese situation as well. So we move on to the last presentation. It will be by Annet Bakker, dedicated now to the Netherlands. Again, we'll have an overview of the education in prisons in the Netherlands, the past, the present, and the future. So Annet Bakker comes from the Netherlands and has been a teacher, a prison teacher for more than 30 years, working in Amsterdam, Neuvegang, okay, currently Zandstad prison, always with male adult prisoners. She was the Dutch prison teachers representative from 2009 till 2013, a period in which she was the linking pin of the Dutch prison teachers, made a connection with prison policy makers, and initiated several national and international projects. Special focus has been on dyslexia and interdisciplinary detention plans, in which education and reintegration have a central position. With other colleagues, she formed the official Dutch EPEA branch. In 2015, she was chosen to be the EPEA chairperson, and in June 2018, her presidency of the EPEA was prolonged with another 3 years. At the moment, she is the EPEA Netherlands board member and works as a teacher in a psychiatry ward in Zandstad prison. Thank you.
Thank you for having me in this inspiring environment of Montijo. First time here, I've been to Porto, worked together with José very often in the EPA steering committee, and very much a pleasure to be here. My presentation is on the Dutch education in prisons. When I was listening to Paal and José, I was struck by their organizations. In Holland, you would find it's very differently organized. Teachers are employed by the Ministry of Justice. And I don't have an overview of when we got an insight into what should have been done in the field of education. But at the moment, and I know numbers are not everything, but José, you and I, we seem to have the same number of prisoners, like about 11,000, 12,000. So Holland and Portugal are the same. You have about 500 teachers? Yeah, well, sort of. We've got 50. So just to give you a rough idea. Paal has got 1/3 of our prisoners, and he's got about 230 or something. So you can do the math yourself. Apart from the number of teachers, because the quality is not always in the numbers, the most striking thing is the way it's organized. I'm employed by the Ministry of Justice. So, focus on rules, safety, security. No one has a clue about education. I mean, in both your countries, the Ministry of Education is involved, meaning there's an audit. Paal, you talk about an audit. Someone who's checking, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? Are we doing it in the right way? In my country, none of that. I'm a bit critical about our system at the moment. I hope I will be more positive in the future. But this is a very important lack of management, I think. So, I bring you this presentation to give you an overview of the Dutch system. Let me see. We have 24 prisons in Holland, and one in overseas in one of our former colonies, now our fellow countrymen. It's in Bonaire, so it's a long way off, and it's completely on its own, let me tell you. We are not dealing in, I'm not dealing with the education in the juvenile institutions, because they're governed, they're managed in a different way. And the forensic care is also governed by other divisions within our system. So I'm talking to you about all the education in the adult institutions, which are 24. A few years ago, we had 49, just like you in Portugal. But we decided to skip a few old ones and have less people and more 2 in 1 cell. And then when you talk about management, we've got 2 in 1 cell, but we still have the teachers for 1 in 1 cell. So we get to see them less and less. Okay. The legal framework in Holland is based on a penitentiary law, stating that prisoners have a right to education. And there is a vision of education, which always makes me laugh, because the vision of education is made by people that have no clue about education. But nevertheless. Here it is small, but there it is. You can read it. It's quite big. Every prisoner has a right to education. So we can tick the box. They all have a right. So, okay. In practice, this means that I can see them once a week, and most of the time they also have to choose between other activities, which are also very important. I'm not using my notes, so I think I'll be quick today. The vision of education in prison in Holland is mainly focused on improving the situation after release on the labour market, which is a very narrow view of what education should be for. And therefore it's focused on recognised certification, like formal education. And they say it's person-bound and independent learning, meaning we don't need as many teachers because they're learning independently, and the teacher is just a sort of coach. In practice, this means that we've got all kinds of prisoners together in the same, like what we saw in the film by Thomas in Switzerland, and I guess in your countries it's the same, but maybe not. We have them doing all kinds of different things because they have to come in an allocated time slot, and during that time slot they have education. So some are doing English or math or Dutch or it's health and safety certificate. So we all got them in the same allocated time slot. We cannot have dedicated classes for just Dutch as a second language or okay. In 2016, the vision document was adapted and became shorter, and but with a few more focuses. So this was an important period in our vision on detention in general. We sort of also had the import model introduced a few years ago, and we are working, which is a good thing, I think, with a plan. Each prisoner has an individual detention and reintegration plan. I will talk about it a bit more in detail later on. And education was a solid part of that plan. Workshops, the labour activities, the work activities in the prisons would be collaborating with education department, the teachers, and it stated that digital education should be offered whenever possible, meaning if we do it digitally, we don't need so many teachers, which is also a very narrow view in my opinion, but who am I? The first 2016 addition to the vision states that the detention and reintegration plan sort of ensures that every prisoner, when he comes into the prison, is screened on 6 or 7 items, could I say. So he is screened and they talk about how's your housing, how have you lived before and how do you think you will live after release. Have you got your administration in order? Have you got a bank account? Have you got a passport or identity card? How is all that? So that's how's the relation with your family? What's your support? What's your backup? Who's there for you? And then you've got the health issues, and of course there's a lot of drug and mental issues. We all know that. Then you get to the financial bit. So how are you dealing with life? Where did you find the money? In other people's houses? Or no, sorry, that's not nice. No. But how are you going to deal with this after release? And then the suitcase is I think symbolic for work and education. Education is connected to the work item. Again, in my opinion, too much focus on paid work after release. There is a little bit of mention of finding sensible things to do whenever you've got time, but I've never heard any policymakers talk about lifelong learning, whereas they would like us to be learning all the time. It should also apply for prisoners, I think. Being part of the detention and reintegration plan, education is always offered to everyone. There's no exclusion, so that's something we do right. For Dutch and for foreigners, we always offer Dutch as a foreign language. And I've sort of specialized in those classes because they're a lot of fun. English, math, and digital skills. It's a very 90-80 program, I think. And it's, since it's not connected to any school, we keep on holding on to this basic offer. There's no one who's questioning, like, is this still what we should have as a basic offer, or should we have more? If you want to make use of the extended curriculum, so like vocational certification or distance learning, you need to have permission. You need to, within our system, you have a mentor and a case manager, and everyone will be looking at you, and when you show the right behavior and the right motivation and initiatives, you'll be in green, let me say. And if you are a bad boy and you have parties all the time or are aggressive, you'll be in the red. And if you're in the red, you will not be allowed to the extended curriculum. This always is a bit difficult. And then the second point of the 2016 addition to the vision was that workshops and education collaborate, which really makes me laugh, because the policymakers seem to think that the education is a way off in the building itself, and the workshops are somewhere else, and this is why we do not work together. But in my opinion, when they started to organize the vocational trainings, they never included the teachers to discuss what should be done to make sure that we go in the same direction. So that's a missed opportunity, and now they're trying to make up for that mistake. Let me see, because I cannot continue any further. Yeah, I can. They have installed a new project to try to make up for the error, and it's joining reintegration activities. We do have a lot of other reintegration activities, and the one thing that we are doing well is the reintegration center. Each prison has a reintegration center where prisoners can go and take care of everything they need to take care of, like administration, the financial position, and they are supported by interns from bachelor studies, and so there they can make a start, and they can do it themselves, and they will be supported. Yeah. The last bit of the additional vision is that digital education should be offered wherever possible. Every prison in Holland has the same basic curriculum, and nationally it's taken care of that we use the same materials, and those are provided for, so that's well done. The challenges, however, are the same as I think everywhere, that ICT is outdated rather quickly. I mean, your own computer, your own telephone, you don't keep it for long because it doesn't offer enough possibilities with the new technology. And by the time that our prison service has managed to install everything they thought of installing 5 years ago, it's already outdated. So that's, I think, an ongoing challenge. There's always, as you know, the ICT and the complication of security. And then you lose a lot of user-friendliness. We do have computers in all our prisons, so that's okay. We have internet facilities, but a lot of it is blocked, because then but if you want to do an academic study, you want to go here and then from there, and then you can only do the first step. So it's complicated, and it asks a lot of the teachers who really want to help and have to find ways of catering for this need. Academic studies are not included in the vision. We talk about the basic offer and vocational training, and then there's no vision on higher education, secondary education. We do have a possibility to do some vocational training, but as I said, because we, as teachers, are never included in the organization of these offers, it's not organized. And we will have to see whether they find solutions. And I'm willing to talk about it, but I think they don't want to know, because they can just not do it. This is a presentation of the policy advisor, and she says that the role of the teachers is changing. I don't think that is a challenge. I think the challenge is to bring your teachers to the level where they should be, to be in contact with what is happening outside. Like Paal was saying, and José, that whatever you start inside the prison should be continued outside, or at least you should be able to continue. And if you don't bring along your teachers, because I finished my degree maybe 35 years ago, Since then, no one told me to do anything. So, I mean, I'm not brought along. I don't know how the regular schools work. Of course, I do know. I have children, but it's not organised. So the responsibility of the prison service is not extended to bringing along the teachers in a learning process. My overall opinion is that there is a lack of coherency in the managing of education in prison, and therefore a lot of what could have been very nice is not happening. And this brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Annet Bakker. So, Annet took us through the Dutch prison education system. We learned about the legislation, vision, organization, and the connection with these detention and reintegration plans, and the challenges for the future, as I've seen. So we had predicted some time for questions, but since we are already past 1 o'clock, we won't have any questions from the public. Estavam previstas perguntas, momento de debate agora, mas uma vez que vamos dado o adiantado da hora e vamos ter mais 2 dias de congresso, portanto haverá também lugar para que as vossas questões possam ser colocadas mais tarde, mesmo a estes moderadores, a estes oradores. Portanto, agradeço a todos, thank you so much for your presentation. E dou por encerrado então este primeiro painel.
Vou entregar então os respectivos certificados.
Obrigada a todos.